Welcome, everybody. My name is Sue Schneider with Colorado State University Extension. This is a video about emotional resilience. It's about how we can go beneath the storm, beneath the waves of difficulty. There is an emotional toll that this pandemic is taking, and that is real. We need to be able to acknowledge that reality. We need to care for ourselves, and we need to care for others right now. We need to do this with self-compassion, with compassion for others, and with an open heart for this suffering world. We are experiencing stressful events like illness, like loss of income and loss of jobs, the loss of our routines, loneliness and isolation. And we tend to add a lot of fuel to what is already difficult. There's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of fear out there, and there's a lot of kind of judging thoughts. We're turning on ourselves because we don't feel like we have a lot of control. And I shared this equation in the last video that suffering equals pain, the initial difficulty that's happening, multiplied by our resistance or our reaction to those difficulties. And the point I was making in the last slide is that we tend to layer on some reactivity that maybe if we could become a little bit more aware of, we could be able to respond a little bit more without going so deeply into the stories that are producing a lot of this anxiety and difficulty. That we might be able to do things differently instead of turning away from this difficulty and wanting to push it away. How do we turn towards it? How do we learn from it? Instead of trying to run away, how do we stay present with what's going on? We might actually be able to accept that control is not something we have available to us. And if we can release that idea that we have a lot of control and kind of more let go or surrender into what's happening, not with being apathetic about it, but being able to just open up to what maybe other possibilities are, then how might that help us in the long term? We can also, by bringing presence and awareness to what's going on, perhaps make choices that can sustain and support us better, treating ourselves with kindness and compassion, and even potentially, and this may feel a little bit out there, but looking for opportunities to grow through these difficult circumstances. So emotions are complicated, and I want to kind of unpack a little bit about fear and anxiety, if this might be helpful just in kind of taking a look at what is causing some of those reactions, and then how might we respond differently. So if you're living through this pandemic, you are probably experiencing some level of fear. And fear is actually, by definition, the anticipation of future pain. It's a very much a future-focused emotion, usually a specific event or trigger, kind of like what we're living through, kind of triggers our hormonal systems. It produces a sympathetic nervous system reaction. It doesn't just live in our minds. It actually goes far deeper into our bodies than we may recognize. Our nervous system responds to fear. The release of stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol are happening when we're in these difficult reactions. And we get into kind of an emergency state of mind. But again, this is very anticipatory. The reality is that the physiological effects of fear only lasts a few seconds. It's the emotional reaction that persists, and it is stimulated by our fearful thoughts. Even if we're not under a specific threat, we're continuing to propel that fight or flight reaction. So Tara Brach, who is a psychologist, refers to this as the trance of fear. So on one hand, we know fear can guide us in a very healthy way. We can get out of danger when we need to, but it can also entrap us in a trance of fear and reactivity that can last a while. It can become really the core of our identity if we're operating from a place of fear. It can constrict our capacity to live fully. We might become tight and kind of live within that tension of fear. It might trap us into more rigid patterns and obsessions and hardcore worry. And again, what this is all about is a future-focused anticipation. It's not necessarily something that is present and happening in this moment. But when we do experience fear, we definitely want to elicit our control strategies, whatever those might be. It could be looking for a cause for the problem. Why am I feeling so afraid and anxious? And sometimes we might search for a reason. We might become really intense on looking for the cause of the problem, or this might end up turning into blaming or finger pointing. That again is only propelling the fear and anxiety. Or we might be cutting ourselves off from our feelings if it feels too uncomfortable. We might be pushing away or numbing our experiences, and this could manifest in anxiety, more anxiety. All very natural responses, but useful to take a look at what's actually happening as we're propelling our fight or flight reaction. When we're worrying, ultimately, we're simply not present. We're not available for what's going on because we're so focused on the future or what's going to happen. Tara Brach writes, rather than living in open acceptance to this changing, living, and dying world, we kind of clamp down and are rigged to control things with our mind and our behaviors. We try to hold on to what is pleasant and push away what's unpleasant. And what we find is that in moments of controlling, we can't really experience what is here. And so we miss out on the present moment, the experiences that we could be having. So there's a paradox here. So in our emotional discomfort, we often try to control things to make them feel more manageable, but our efforts to control actually further trap us into our anxiety and feeling worse. So if we cling too hard to the way we want things to be, we tend to suffer. And the other side of this is our tendency to push those uncomfortable emotions away. But what we also know is that what we resist persists. It's a myth that we can actually limit our fear and anxiety by shutting it out, by pushing it away. And so this is really instructive to know. What we resist persists. The other thing to note is that when we push away the difficult emotions, we're also banishing our positive emotions. So Brene Brown, a social worker, writes that we cannot selectively numb emotions. When we numb the painful emotions, we also numb the positive emotions. So how do we do things differently? How can we learn to skillfully work with all of the challenges that are coming up in our daily lives in this moment? And the concept of leaning in can be really useful. Leaning in or accepting fear is really counterintuitive for a lot of us because of the reasons I've been talking about. But the reality is that actually opening up to these difficult emotions can be really freeing. And instead of creating this tightness and tension, if we step in and contact what exactly is going on, we actually can open up some space, and it actually diminishes sometimes the power of these emotions. So you might ask yourself, if fear or anxiety is coming up for you and you're not sure what to do, take a look at it. Ask yourself, how big is it really? Where is it living in your body? A lot of times you'll feel it in your stomach or your chest, just noticing. And when you notice what's going on, asking yourself, can I make space for this? So sometimes you just don't have to solve the problem of fear. You don't have to control fear, but it helps if you can maybe accommodate it a little bit, maybe make some space for it. So really what we're doing is widening the lens. We're asking ourselves how we can relate to the fear rather than from the fear. And in a sense, this is actually our practice of responding rather than reacting. And if you can let the fear lead you to the vulnerability that's actually underneath it, you can notice that we're all feeling afraid and vulnerable now. And this sense of we're actually in this together can really be a gateway to compassion. And from that point, it's not just your pain, it's everyone's pain. And the caring about yourself in this moment could be extended outward to everyone else who is suffering, which really can actually do a lot of good for your own suffering. So the process of letting go of the stories, of the personalization of this fear that it's only you, asking what the heck is wrong with me that I'm having these reactions, this is a process, and it's a process of letting go. So Tara Brach writes, as long as we are alive, we feel fear. It's an intrinsic part of our makeup, as natural as a bitter cold winter day. Facing fear is a lifelong training in letting go of all that we cling to. What really we're learning is about, as odd as it may sound, that simply the intentional knowing and understanding of your feelings in times of emotional suffering actually contain in itself the seeds of healing. Jon Kabat-Zinn suggests this, and he argues that it's a gradual process, this intentional knowing. It's not that you suddenly jump into your fear and do all of this exploration. He argues that we don't bulldoze through our resistance, because it's a natural intelligence to be resistant to stepping into this fear, but that we can gently work at the edges, a little here, a little there, especially during the times of greatest pain and difficulty. And we might actually find that these difficult emotions are not as solid as we think. So when we actually take the moments to observe what's happening within us, we might see that if we check in throughout the day, that the emotions are actually shifting and changing. That we could view emotions kind of like clouds in the sky. They come and they go. You might wake up the next morning and say, this actually feels a little bit different. It may not be better, but it may just be different. And so the instruction here is to watch. Watch your fear itself, but watch your fear of your fear. Watch your anxiety about your anxiety. And notice how you might be amplifying your suffering. Notice how things loosen up and change when you simply bring a kind attention to what's going on. So we might think about working with emotions in terms of learning to ride the waves or learning to surf. Riding the waves means that we stay relaxed and flexible enough to directly experience the waves without getting tossed around or pulled under the water. In other words, we don't get stuck in our storylines about our fear or anxiety, or we don't contract when it arrives, because it's going to arrive. We can stay open, we can stay available to whatever is happening without judgment. And that is actually the definition of mindfulness. So I want to just share some truths about human resilience. We are incredibly resilient as a species. Number one, there is no species on Earth that is more anxious than humans, because we are the ones who have the capacity to imagine a future. But at the same time, we are the most capable, resourceful, and resilient species to live on Earth. Number two, resilience is our shared genetic and psychological inheritance. We are genetic survivors of hundreds of thousands of years of tumult and struggle. And this is no different if we put it in evolutionary context. Number three, we all came from a long line of people who made the next correct move, survived difficult things, and were able to pass on their genes. And four, we all draw from a deep reservoir of shared human consciousness that knows exactly what to do in moments of difficulty. We just sometimes don't trust ourselves. And those truths actually are from Elizabeth Gilbert, who shares a lot of wisdom in these moments. So what do? As I've been suggesting, we learn and we practice turning towards some of our difficulties. We explore the concept that control is a myth, that perhaps we didn't have it in the first place, and look at what that means for us in our lives, and maybe that can help us let go a little bit. We learn to relate to rather than from our difficulty, which is a way of responding rather than reacting and tensing up when that uncomfortable emotion comes up. We learn to stay present with whatever's happening. We explore it, especially within our body, which seats all of our emotions. We bring awareness to what's going on so we can make healthy choices to support ourselves when we're experiencing the waves. And we treat ourselves and others with kindness. May I be well. We're allowed to send ourselves self-compassion. And we use the energy of emotional pain to be able to grow. And most importantly, we don't beat ourselves up when things don't go well. This is unprecedented times. We are experiencing unprecedented emotions, and so we have to be open to what is happening and without judgment. Finally, and most important, really, really important to remember to notice the beauty in our lives and around us. The beauty is still there despite whatever is going on. And as Mary Oliver so astutely asked, and this is pandemic aside, tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? So consider that. I appreciate your time. There are additional resources on the Larimer County Extension website. You can explore a series of mindful self-care videos that are there. You can explore the Living Mindfully online program through CSU Online. And there are lists of ongoing wellness classes that are free and open to the public every single month. Just go to larimerextension.org, and I wish you well.